Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honour for me to address the Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Brother Anthony and all of his colleagues, his fellow officers that are supporting the Society's work, because I think the work that you do in introducing this country, its culture, its history, and the society, wider society, to the wider public is of real importance, and I want to pay tribute to the Society's sponsors for supporting such a very important cause and being such good corporate citizens in doing so. The Somerset Palace, of course, is one of the foremost sponsors in that sense, and the Somerset Palace here has been the venue for many erudite and stimulating lectures on a huge variety of subjects, and it's hosted many impressive cultural performances under the Society's auspices in recent years. And I'm afraid that my talk this evening will fall some way short of the insights and erudition that you're used to. But I thought it might be of some interest just to talk about what the British Ambassador to the Republic of Korea does in the early years of the 21st century, and compare it a little bit to the experience of some of my predecessors over the 130 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Joseon and the United Kingdom, and reflect on how the head of missions role in Seoul has changed in that period. And I'm indebted to Jim Hoare and Warwick Morris for much of what follows this evening. I'm not sure how many of you really have a sense of what embassies do, or what it's like to work in an embassy. The caricature in the UK is a life of endless cocktail parties and diplomats sipping champagne and eating Ferrero Rocher chocolates. I doubt if it ever really was quite like that. But if it was, then it certainly isn't like that now. In fact, if you want to get a feel for the reality, you could do worse. You could do worse than watch the recent comedy series on the BBC called Ambassadors, starring David Mitchell and Robert Webb. I should apologise. The slides that you're going to see this evening are of variable quality. Some of them are very sharp, some of them are distinctly pixelated. So I apologise for that in advance. This sitcom, Ambassadors, is set in the fictional Central Asian country of Tajikistan. And it avoids most of the UK stereotypes and offers a sympathetic portrayal of some of the challenges British diplomats face in their working and personal lives, including the difficult decisions that have to be made when we're faced with conflicting national objectives, and also the frustrating conversations on Skype with the family back in the UK over unreliable internet connections, and sometimes with less than forthcoming children. The fact is that the IT revolution and 24-hour news cycles have radically altered the way we operate as diplomats, even from my first posting in Beijing in the 1980s. Like people working in any business these days, email and social media mean that in the embassy we're communicating constantly with our colleagues in London and other posts in the Asia-Pacific region. The job is much more 24/7 than it ever was in the past. Policy submissions going to our ministers are joint efforts by staff in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and in embassies. Less than 30 years ago, telegrams from London were circulated in hard copies around the embassy in Beijing twice a day, and we had 2 separate hour-long slots in which we could send our telegrams back to London. Every word was carefully weighed. There was much greater sense of isolation. But even so, our autonomy on the big issues was, as today, still quite limited. Our personal lives, too, have changed a lot in the last 30 years. In Beijing, the cost of making an international phone call and the difficulty in getting an operator to put the call through meant that Anne and I spoke to our families maybe once every 3 weeks. I was 4th on the distribution list for The Observer when I first arrived in China in November 1986. The paper was at least a week old, sometimes 2, when it arrived in the embassy in the diplomatic bag conveyed by the Queen's messenger. And by the time it reached me, it was 4 weeks old. Today, we read the FT in hard copy or online every morning. How very different to the life and challenges facing Britain's first representatives here. Sir Harry Parkes was an old China hand, having arrived in the 1840s during the First Opium War. He went on to work in Siam and Japan, serving for 18 years from 1865 as British Minister, before arriving in Seoul in 1883, en route to taking over as Minister in Beijing. Aston spent much of his career in the consular service based in Japan. And that's not Walter Hillier. We haven't got a photo of Walter Hillier, sorry. And Walter Hillier, whose wife laid the foundation stone of the residence, served for 20 years in China before coming to Seoul. These men were steeped in East Asia, even if they were initially unfamiliar with Korea. No annual leave journeys back to the UK for them, rather years of service before sailing back for very rare breaks that would then last for months. Happily for them, they did not know the tyranny of the Outlook inbox. Instead, their dispatches took weeks to arrive in King Charles Street in London, although even then the telegraph facilitated speedier communication when really necessary. Because of that distance, they enjoyed some degree of autonomy, and in some instances, their plenipotentiary and extraterritorial powers gave them an authority I certainly don't possess. I doubt if those of you who are citizens of the United Kingdom, or Canada, or Australia, would be at all happy if you found yourselves appearing before a court at the residence, with me in the position of judge and jury. These men had significant latitude in determining where to focus their efforts within the parameters of broad British imperial objectives. Today, we consider the region in the context of the re-emergence of China as a great power and US-China power dynamics. Back then, it was Britain's great rivalries with Russia, the decline of the Qing dynasty, the rise of Japan, and the echoes of the rise of Germany in Europe that set the geopolitical context for Parkes, Aston, Hillier, and their successors. Added to this, they had to build Britain's diplomatic presence up from scratch, procuring a site, designing and building a residence and office space, even a garden, tasks today that we turn to estate specialists, property developers, and others to fulfill. Some things never change, though. Parkes, Aston, and the Foreign Office had to fight hard to overcome Treasury opposition to spending the sum of £200 to acquire the original house and the land we now occupy. If the Treasury hadn't been so obdurate, we could have had it for £100. And even at 200, it proved to be a fantastic investment. Another thing that hasn't changed is provision of consular protection and assistance to British nationals, still one of our core responsibilities. And even if the size of the community for which we have responsibility, up to 8,000 residents with short-term visitors on top of that, even if that size is a lot bigger than the couple of hundred or so residents in Korea at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, I suspect that today's community is a lot less demanding, for which I'm very grateful. But I hasten to add that no one should hesitate to contact us for the assistance to which you are entitled. But the experience of Henry Coburn, who arrived in Seoul in 1905, provides an interesting illustration of the limits to the consul's autonomy even then. Coburn's appointment coincided, of course, with the great catastrophe for Korea of the Japanese occupation. In 1908, Coburn clashed with the local Japanese authorities as he tried to protect Yang Ki-taek, the Korean journalist and vocal critic of the occupation. Yang sought refuge at the British-owned Korea Daily News after escaping from Japanese custody. Coburn refused to allow the Japanese to enter the premises to re-arrest him. But after a protracted correspondence with Sir Claude MacDonald in Tokyo and Sir Edward Grey in London, he was eventually instructed to hand Yang over. As many of you will know, Coburn chose to resign, having done as instructed. I'm not quite sure how much autonomy one of his successors enjoyed, though. is the centenary of Arthur de la Mar's birthday on Friday. He arrived here to lead the post as Vice-Consul in 1938 at the tender age of just 24. He later said that he explained to visitors seeking his advice that he had no consular experience whatsoever, but that he was a Jersey man and a farmer, and that a Jersey farmer was the best source of advice that you could get anywhere in the world. An assessment with which I'm sure my predecessor, Martin Uden, would agree, and sensibly so, since Fiona Uden is a proud Jersey woman. For very obvious reasons, I'm relieved that my tenure as ambassador has, so far at least, been less dramatic than Sir Vivian Holt's was as minister at the outbreak of the Korean War. And this is Sir Vivian on the screen. Holt heard the news that North Korean forces had attacked on the 25th of June and that there was heavy fighting along 38th parallel. Believing it his duty to remain, and naively that he would be protected by diplomatic immunity, he stayed at the residence and the compound, taking refuge with the Anglican bishop, amongst others. With his colleagues, who included George Blake, who incidentally is still living in Moscow in his 90s, Holt spent the hours waiting for the arrival of North Korean troops by destroying codebooks and secret documents, before being detained and then marched north to Pyongyang and beyond. When he was released 3 years later, his health was broken, but while George Blake, one of his co-captives, broke and was turned by his captors, Holt maintained his integrity. Monsignor Thomas Quinlan, the Prefect Apostolic of Chuncheon, later wrote, "I wish formally to place on record the courage, heroism and kindness of Captain Vivian Holt, the British minister in Seoul. Time and again during captivity he fought my case with the Koreans, declaring that not only was I a priest of God, but an Irish citizen, and Ireland wasn't in this shindy, that the Koreans wouldn't listen." Of course, many Irishmen were indeed involved in that particular shindy. The experiences of these men have an epic quality about them, even though some are within living memory. Our work today seems much more mundane, but in terms of UK national interests, I would argue that it's just as, and in some respects, even more important. So what do we do in the embassy? What do I do? Well, the purpose of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is very simple and clear. We promote British interests overseas, supporting our citizens and businesses around the globe. And so fundamentally, that's what we do here in Korea as well. We've quite a large team working on trade and investment, including defence sales, and small teams working on political issues, economic issues, science and innovation, climate change, and media and public affairs. We have a small consular section. My defence attaché, Brigadier Cliff, is supported by a warrant officer, and underpinning all of our activities is a corporate services section, although many of our back office functions are now provided from the embassy in Manila. The corporate services section works closely with an outsourced facilities management company. We've around 15 UK-based staff and about 70 locally engaged staff, most of them Korean, and most of them female, as it happens. A typical work for me will consist of a mixture of events covering the range of the embassy's activities. So that might include meetings with chaebol CEOs or the chairman of one of the major banks, where the two principal priorities for me are securing their involvement in delivering the UK government's huge infrastructure development programme and facilitating partnerships between the chaebol and UK companies on projects in third country markets like the Gulf and Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm also often seeing the leaders of the major public and private institutional investors, such as the National Pension Service and the Korea Investment Corporation, talking to them about investment opportunities in UK infrastructure. I often meet senior executives from UK companies visiting Korea to brief them on the political and economic scene and discuss ways in which the different teams in the embassies can help them. In many cases, they will want to discuss problems they're having in overcoming non-tariff barriers or non-implementation of the provisions of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or dealing with the web of Korean regulation. And to follow up on such concerns, I'm regularly lobbying senior officials in the Korean government or trying to get our arguments across in public. So here I am with the Deputy Prime Minister. And public diplomacy, in one form or another, always features somewhere during the week. This comes in many guises, from the traditional speech or newspaper article to fairly regular tweeting. Those of you on Twitter can follow me on @UKAnd_Wightman. But I also do occasional radio and TV interviews. Sorry about the socks in that particular one. When my mother saw that back in the UK, she was absolutely appalled that I had socks and I weren't matching. Lunch at the residence might be with a member of the National Assembly, a Korean academic or senior journalist, or a minister or senior official, during which I will aim to develop my understanding of the Korean perspective on a key policy issue and try to persuade my guest of the merits of the UK position or the benefits in adapting Korea's position. On the economic side, I'll be talking about the underlying strengths of the UK economy, the Prime Minister's initiative from last year's G8 summit on trade, tax and transparency, or the major reform of our electricity market, the challenges facing foreign investors in Korea. On the security side, the situation on the Korean Peninsula, China and Northeast Asian security, and Korea's role in tackling global challenges are regular topics for conversation. Guests are often interested in learning how our ambassador in Pyongyang sees the situation, or my own experiences of visiting the North, of which more later. Quite often, I find myself making congratulatory remarks at the opening of a conference, or a seminar, or a new UK business in Korea. I'm ashamed that in contrast to my immediate predecessors, Warwick Morris and Martin Newton, my Korean isn't good enough for me to offer these entirely in Korean. But I usually have the first few paragraphs translated, and I'm able to read these out, and I hope that people appreciate that I've at least made an effort. These occasions are an opportunity for me to develop my contact network, open doors in target organisations for colleagues in the embassy, and get across some core messages. So, for example, this afternoon, I opened the Green Building Seminar at the Plaza Hotel. I used this to talk a little bit about the UK government's approach to combating dangerous climate change, the economic opportunities available to Korean firms from developing the low-carbon economy here in Korea, the importance of ambitious action from the Korean government, and the capabilities of UK firms in this area. Sometimes, as Woody Allen would say, it's simply a question of just showing up. Our last ambassador in Tokyo called it the Zen of ambassadorship. Surprisingly, it can take quite a bit of getting used to. The day might close with a dinner or reception at the residence. These come in many forms, perhaps a reception for a visiting commercial delegation. Here it's the Lord Mayor of London promoting UK legal services with the chairwoman of the National Assembly Judicial and Legal Affairs Committee and the President of the Korean Bar Association among the guests. Or it might be something focused on deepening research and development links. We're investing a lot of effort in working with UK alumni associations in Korea, which I see as a relatively untapped resource for the UK. And many of our alumni particularly enjoy coming to Broughton's Bar in the embassy basement. And that's a great opportunity for them to meet Koreans who've studied at the same university in the UK. And it's a great opportunity for us to build up networks of specialists to whom we can turn for advice and help in advancing our objectives, and to strengthen the bilateral relationship in specific areas, for example, nuclear safety, or financial services, or the creative sector. And our alumni are our best ambassadors for the UK's world-class higher education institutions, helping us to convince more Korean students to consider the UK, and more Korean parents that their children should go to the UK rather than the US or China or Australia for under and postgraduate studies. In fact, the range of events we host at the Embassy in residence these days is very varied indeed. Looking at photographs from the early part of the 20th century, the impression one gets is that events at the residence focus very much on entertaining other members of the expatriate community, including the odd fancy dress party, with the purpose being more social than business. Things are very different now. We are actively encouraging UK firms and organisations to look on the residence as a resource. So now we have companies using the house or the garden to launch their presence in Korea, or as a venue for a seminar, or as a unique location to hold a fashion show to launch this year's autumn collection, or perhaps for a dinner party to seduce a key Korean business partner. But of course, we have retained some of the traditional events, notably the Queen's birthday party and the biennial Royal Asiatic Society garden party. As some of you will know, I missed the Society's event last year because of a flight cancellation from Pyongyang, where I had spent the previous week. And that is one area where my experience has been very different from most of my post-war predecessors. Inter-Korean relations are, for very obvious reasons, an important priority for the Embassy. Our objectives are to work for peace on the peninsula, for the protection of the freedoms of the citizens of the Republic of Korea, for the denuclearization of the peninsula and elimination of North Korea's proliferation activities, and for the human rights of North Koreans. We work very closely with our colleagues in Pyongyang, communicating with them on a daily basis. We also coordinate closely with the South Korean authorities, the US and other embassies, as well as the members of UN Command. The life of my colleague in Pyongyang, Mike Gifford, is very different. Here's a picture of his residence. That's it at the far end of that block of buildings. And these are the embassy staff flats. And this is the embassy itself. We are in fact tenants of the German embassy, occupying office space and apartments in the old East German embassy compound. Life for our colleagues in Pyongyang is very hard. They are isolated, the expat community is very small, the availability of goods and fresh produce is incredibly limited. And as a consequence, 2 members of staff have to take our 2 Discovery Land Rover vehicles and drive them north to Dandong on the border, across the river, once every month or so, to fill the 2 Land Rovers up with goods, fresh produce, meat, vegetables that can be taken back and used by the staff over the next 3 or 4 weeks. Medical facilities are very poor, and of course flight availability is very limited too. Professionally, for our colleagues in Pyongyang, work is very challenging. Even down to basic things like arranging appointments can take weeks. They have very limited access to officials within the Korean government, and they need to take every opportunity to get our points across. They find the local residents extremely reticent. It's very, very difficult for ordinary North Korean citizens to speak to foreign diplomats. And it's difficult for our diplomats to get permission to travel outside a very narrow range of places in North Korea. The purpose of our embassy in Pyongyang is to pursue our policy there of critical engagement with the North Korean authorities. And it has 2 basic focuses. The first is sustained dialogue with the North Korean authorities on their nuclear and ballistic missile programs, trying to get across our arguments that the North Korean government's policies in these areas are completely unacceptable. The second focus is on the human rights situation in North Korea. And in pursuit of that, we run a number of modest aid projects focused on human rights and assisting the most vulnerable groups in North Korea: disabled people, orphans, breastfeeding mothers. We also run a small English language teaching program with 4 English language teachers teaching English language teachers in institutions in Pyongyang. And we take about a dozen or 15 North Korean officials to the United Kingdom to spend 4 weeks in the UK every year living with British families, and learning about the way that the West works. Our objective in doing this is to try to demonstrate to North Koreans that the outside world is not hostile, that there is another way, and to expose at least some members from the elite the realities of life outside North Korea, that we accept that this is very long-term work. Unlike all but my recent predecessors, I'm able to visit Pyongyang, and I aim to get there about once a year. I have to travel via Beijing and pick up a visa there. My most recent trip was in June last year. And during the visit, I was able to meet one of the vice foreign ministers, a member of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party, and a lieutenant general in the KPA, as well as ambassadors from other countries and representatives of the United Nations agencies and NGOs working in the country. I'm going to show you now some slides to give you a sense of what life is like in and outside Pyongyang. There's a series of slides to start off with here that are just of grass. And you'd be wondering, why on earth am I showing you slides of grass? This was because in June last year, in every town and city that we were in, every village we were in, the grass verges were being dug up, and the earth was being sieved, it was being sterilised, it was being put back, and grass was being re-sown, simply because Kim Jong-un had, a few weeks before, said that steps had to be taken to beautify the towns and cities and villages of North Korea. You can see this small verge, which is in Wonsan. Even there, very small area of grass has been cultivated. And here we are back in Pyongyang, and all of these people in this park area are engaged in grass planting and grass tending. See how each of these individuals is just working away at a little patch, keeping that little patch weeded and watered. And think of the immense labour that's invested in this completely redundant activity. And it makes you realise, it makes you understand one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, why the North Korean economy is in such a parlous state. This is the main road between Pyongyang and Wonsan. You can see how busy it, well no, you can't see how busy it is, it's rather dim. Is it possible to turn the lights down, perhaps? It's not going to work. You'll have to take my word for it. There's no traffic on the road. This is one of the vehicles that we passed on the way to Wonsan. Thank you very much. It's a charcoal-powered vehicle, lorry. And we saw quite a few of these in our travels. People are very, very ingenious in the way in which they make do and mend with what's available. I've included this, that you can just see through the trees, the extent of the deforestation that there is. I've seen pictures of what South Korea looked like in the 1950s and 1960s, and I've travelled quite extensively in rural areas in North Korea. There are very, very few trees to be seen, and it reminded me of pictures of South Korea in the 50s and 60s, and it's just an ecological disaster in the north. And you see crops being cultivated on very steep slopes, which just adds to the erosion, the soil erosion, and reduces the yield of the harvests. Here we have, these are taken from moving cars, so that they're a little bit blurred, but this is a typical rural house, rural dwelling in North Korea, a semi-detached bungalow. They look quite pleasant from the outside, and they retain obviously the traditional Korean characteristics, but sanitation and the general state of the buildings is very, very poor. It's a village, you see, of that type of housing. This is, sorry, you can't see this very clearly at all. This is the Vinalong factory in Hamhung. Some of you may have heard of it, the entrance to it, and that's part of the factory. It's a huge complex. In scale, it reminded me of the POSCO plant in Pohang. It's just a vast area,
but absolutely decrepit, although still in operation. The reason that we were going to Hamhung was to visit an aid project that the embassy supports, our embassy in Pyongyang supports. It's to grow fresh vegetables that are then fed to women who are breastfeeding to ensure that they are giving some of the vitamins that their babies require. And you can see that the cabbages are very healthy. In fact, we were impressed with the way in which this project was being managed by a North Korean agronomist. There were a series of these sorts of greenhouses with vegetables growing inside them, and a lot of produce was being cultivated. And there you see one of the reasons that this project has proved successful is Kim Jong-il visited it shortly before his death, just 8 or 9 days before he died in 2011, and he was impressed with what he saw and told. During his on-the-spot guidance, told his officials that it was important this project should be supported. So we're confident that it will be able to continue for the future. All of us, or rather the embassy at the time, was completely ignorant of the fact that Kim Jong-il was visiting this project. There you see some of the vegetables growing in one of the greenhouses, and in this same greenhouse, you can see the very spot on which Kim Jong-il stood to give his on-the-spot guidance. And since then, you can see that the tile has been replaced. We spent the night outside Pyongyang in what passes for a resort on the coast, just north of Wonsan. This was one of the villas. There were about 16 of these sorts of villas, which we were accommodated in. There was no one else staying in this particular resort at the time. It was right on the beach. And it was very basic, but the beds were comfortable enough. But I just want to show you the bathroom. The supply of running water was very intermittent, and so when we were taken into our bathrooms, we were shown that there was a bath full of water. Can you just make out a little red basin on the right-hand side of the bath? You use that basin to take water out of the bath to flush the toilet. And what you can't really see, just below the wash hand basin, is a very big red bucket with a lid on it. And that was filled with water as well. And you may be able to see, can you see a wire that's hanging down from the heating element attached to the wall? Can you see a white wire just running down? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was attached to a heating element that you just held with your hand. And to heat the water up, you took this heating element, put it in the water, and then attach the wire to the plug. And I was helpfully told to make sure that I had unplugged from the socket before I touched the water. So that's another example of make do and mend, I think. But the water heated up very quick, well, within an hour. Back in Pyongyang now, and this is the Mansudae complex that was rushed and completed for the centenary of Kim Il-sung's birth, which looks really quite impressive from a distance. Less impressive from close up, although, not too bad at the moment, but the odd tile that's falling off remains to be seen how it stands up to weather over the coming years. But it's quite a good illustration that some parts of Pyongyang superficially look quite impressive. And it is, in fact, a very green city. We'll see a little bit more of that later. But right within half a mile of what we've just seen, downtown Dubai, as we've just seen, you find these dwellings that are, you feel you're right back in the middle of the countryside. Here, in the back of, this is just a quarter of a mile from the embassy, the residence. People growing vegetables in the back of their garden. And what I find impressive there is the great success that people have in producing vegetables intensively when they're given the opportunity to cultivate these private plots. But again, it's just, you wouldn't say that you were in the middle of a capital city. I talked about the greenery, and here you can see one of the parks in Pyongyang. Not very many people around, having said that. What am I doing here? We saw a lot of women carrying these parasols, and it became apparent that the decoration of the parasols were one way of an individual woman demonstrating a degree of individuality. It's a sort of fashion accessory. And here we see another woman with slightly different pattern. And you can see also the woman on the left is wearing a particular sort of, almost like a hanbok. She's a lot of women are dressed around Pyongyang in that fashion. But they are actually keeping an eye on other people and reporting on their behaviour. So if people are crossing the road in a place where they ought not to be doing that, they'll be noted down, they'll be reported. If they're not doing their grass growing activities with sufficient zeal, they will be reported on. Another example of individuality here in what was a massive block of apartments is to see that somebody on their balcony has got a pigeon loft. And again, I was a little bit encouraged to see something like that, somebody having a degree of individuality in their life. This was the newest apartment store that's been built in Pyongyang, although I think another one is being developed under the Chinese at the moment. And what is really surprising is what's inside it. You see shelves stacked with goods that you would expect to see maybe in Home Plus or Lotte Mart. You see rather chic boutiques. And it indicates that there are some people in Pyongyang who have got quite a bit of money and are able to spend that money on goods of this nature, and who want to spend money on goods of this nature, and who don't think it's a problem for them and for their personal security if they spend money on goods of this nature. So it's quite an interesting development, I think. I find that quite encouraging too. This is just a couple of students cuddling each other in a park. But outward displays of affection amongst young people in North Korea are frowned upon. So it's quite nice to see a couple of students defying custom. We saw a lot of playgrounds. Another thing that Kim Jong-un has emphasized he wants to see more of for North Korean citizens. And now just 2 or 3 photos to show you that fundamentally North Korean people are just like people anywhere else in the world. They want the same sorts of things. A couple of young girls going to school. And here a grandmother is playing with a couple of, I don't know if it's a grandmother, but an older woman playing with a couple of young children. And you do see these, occasionally, you catch these glimpses of ordinary life. But it has to be said that most of the time, when you are watching people in Pyongyang or Wonsan, Hamhung, Nampo, all it looks as if they are doing is just trying to survive, getting on with their life, trying to keep a low profile, trying to keep out of trouble. And on each of the occasions when I've left Pyongyang, the overwhelming feeling that I have had is really one of sadness and one of great sadness at the waste of human potential that we see North Korea there. So much for North Korea. One of the greatest privileges of being an ambassador anywhere is the range of really fascinating people you get to meet and the unexpected things you find yourself doing. One of the first visits I had in Korea after I arrived here in November of 2011 was to the National Center for South Korea's Paralympians near Icheon. It's a really high-quality facility, and it was exciting for me to meet some of the athletes and admire their skills. Well, humiliating, actually, when I played table tennis with this particular girl. I enjoyed test driving some of the zero-emission cars Hyundai Kia are developing at their R&D centre at Hwaseong. The British band Muse provided a big contrast to K-pop acts at the Jamsil Stadium last summer. And who could fail to enjoy the wonderful BBC Symphony Orchestra performing Elgar and Vaughan Williams
of the superb Peter Donohoe playing Tchaikovsky at the Seoul Arts Centre. But unquestionably, the most memorable experience for Anne and myself has been being part of the official British suite for President Park's state visit to the United Kingdom in November last year. For the UK, state visits are very special occasions. There are only 2 each year. Her Majesty takes a very personal interest in the programme and ensuring that her guest enjoys and gets value from the experience. The guest stays at Buckingham Palace during the official part of the visit, and it really is a family occasion. The Duke of York collected the President from her hotel to escort her to Horse Guards Parade for the official welcome. The Duke of Edinburgh accompanied the President as she inspected the Guard of Honour at Horse Guards Parade. At the welcoming lunch, the Earl of Wessex, the Princess Royal, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, as well as Her Majesty Prince Philip and the Duke of York, were all there. The Duke of Cambridge welcomed the President to the ceremony where she broke ground on a new Korean War memorial on Victoria Embankment outside the Ministry of Defence. And of course, with all the pageantry, the visit looked fantastic. But an important objective for me was that the visit shouldn't just be about the traditional, well-known images of the United Kingdom. I wanted it also to showcase the best of contemporary Britain and be about the substance of our close bilateral relationship and building for the future. So we arranged for the President to view some of the cutting-edge technologies, including this invisibility cloak made of metamaterials being developed at Imperial College. The President opened a new global CEO forum to foster new business-to-business collaborations, and a joint economic and trade committee in which the 2 governments are identifying barriers to doing business and taking steps to remove them, as well as working on new areas for growth. 22 agreements were signed during the visit between the 2 governments, our universities and research institutes, and our businesses. The challenge for the Embassy and our colleagues in the UK and Korea now is to ensure that these agreements don't just remain bits of paper, but translate into new R&D collaborations, new business deals, practical cooperation on shared global challenges. And that is what is framing a lot of our work here in Seoul at the moment. I would like to finish by talking about something none of my predecessors ever did, and that is leading our great campaign here in Korea. I mentioned earlier the importance of public diplomacy in the work of the Embassy. Well, the GREAT campaign is at the heart of this. The campaign is the UK government's most ambitious international marketing initiative ever. It showcases the very best of what Britain has to offer in order to encourage the world to visit, study and do business in the UK, in particular to engage with our creative economy. It supports the Prime Minister's Global Race for Growth and Olympic Legacy programme. The campaign is currently active in over 86 countries, but Korea is one of the top 10 priority countries for the campaign. Unifying the international growth promotion efforts of UK Trade and Investment, the British Council, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Visit Britain, the GREAT campaign aims to deliver significant and long-term increases in trade, tourism, education and inward investment in support of the government's prosperity and growth agenda. You may have been involved or noticed some of our great events last year. One of the highlights was our GREAT bus, which spent a week in Korea in October. The GREAT bus is actually the first of the new fleet of low-emission London buses, the Boris buses. It combines cutting-edge technology with one of the UK's most iconic images. So it's a perfect example of the 2 themes we're focusing on here in Korea: Great British Innovation and Great British Creativity. We parked the GREAT bus outside the venue for the World Energy Congress in Toyko, where 3,000 delegates from around the world were able to see it. And we used it as the venue for a reception where the British firms taking part in the Congress were able to host their guests. Later in the week, it was at COEX, where the cybersecurity conference was taking place, and William Hague was able to get on board.
and it moved on to Gwanghwamun, where Seoulites were able to hop on for a ride. Our next big events are the Great Festival and Great Week at the end of March. The festival will take place in Garamsukil. The street will feature lots of Union Jacks. The bars in the street serving British beers and whiskies and fashion stores carrying British designs will be decked out with our great branding. We aim to drive more consumers to engage with the best of British food and drink and best of British fashion. And in the following Great Week, the focus will move from consumers to businesses as we stage events that will match Korean buyers, distributors and agents with great British companies. This is all work in support of hard-nosed commercial objectives. And that perhaps takes us back full circle to the objective of the first British diplomats who came to Korea over 100 years ago. Because it was arguably the defence of Britain's trade interests in India that drew us into China, and then the defence of the trade interests we subsequently developed in China that drew us into Korea. Then, as now, we find that Britain's security interests and our economic interests are inextricably linked. We can't pursue one while neglecting the other. But the UK and Korea have both changed hugely in the intervening period. We now share the same broad economic and political values. We're both highly trade-dependent nations. Like the UK, Korea increasingly has global interests, and it's increasingly playing an active and positive role on the international stage, tackling global challenges and supporting the rules-based international system on which the future prosperity of both of our countries depends. It's unquestionably in British interests that our two countries should work ever more closely together to seize the opportunities and manage the risks of globalization. There's a huge range of areas where the embassy can make, and I think is making, a difference. It all means that while being the British ambassador in Seoul is just as much an honour and privilege as being minister here must have been over 100 years ago, I'm convinced that the job is more stimulating and more rewarding than ever. Thank you very much. Shall we do questions?
Very intimidating.
Thank you very much.
Yes, the question is about the defense industry. I think most Koreans and most foreigners here are aware that the Koreans historically have purchased defense equipment from the Americans. Could you just name a few of the UK defense companies that are actively engaged in the market or that are trying to be active in Korea?
Yeah, surely. In fact, our defence equipment and technology relationship is developing in a very interesting way over the last 3 or 4 years. And it reflects the fact that our future requirements in the UK, for the UK armed forces, and the future requirements for Korea's armed forces show a lot of similarities. We've had a number of successes. Rolls-Royce hybrid engine, the MT-30, is being used or will be used in the next generation of Korea's frigates. We have agreed to the Royal Navy is purchasing, Royal Naval Fleet Auxiliary is purchasing 4 tankers, Mars tankers they're called, which are being built in Kochi by DSME, but to a British design. 25% of the content is British manufactured, and that we're very confident is going to lead to joint export orders to third country markets as well. And then, perhaps most significantly of all, last year, Augusta Westland were selected for the Marine Operating Helicopter, the AW159, which will be used by the Korean Navy, particularly on anti-submarine operations. And it's now bidding for the next batch of those helicopters. And we think that also in the future for Korea's future requirements for fighter aircraft, I'm convinced that one way or another the United Kingdom is going to be significantly involved in the provision. But we're also involved in joint research as well in the defence area. We've got an agreement between ADD and counterparts in the United Kingdom, and that's focusing in on some very cutting-edge, sophisticated technologies. So I'm very optimistic about the future of the defence relationship.
Thank you. So, I'm impressed by your explanation of your trip to Pyongyang June last year. Is it possible for me to get some updates from your ambassador in Pyongyang? Because I understand that he travels every 3 or 4 months to Seoul to brief what's happening in Pyongyang. And did you find any activities of English teaching in Pyongyang, specifically by the British Council? Is it booming or is it declining? Thank you.
In fact, the ambassador comes maybe once a year. He's not here 3 or 4 months, he comes maybe once a year. But when he comes, he talks to Korean officials, talks to obviously the UN command is very interested in what he has to say, also academics and journalists here. So there may be an opportunity in the future when he comes here perhaps to meet him. As I said, our English language teaching training program rather than teaching program is very modest in scope. We have one teacher in, I think, 4 different universities in Pyongyang, leading universities, and they are teaching the teachers. That program has been going on for 3 or 4 years. We're just reviewing what's worked, what hasn't worked, before taking decisions on how it might develop in the future, or whether indeed it should continue in the future.
I think I read last year something about Commonwealth resources in respective foreign services being shared, Commonwealth countries. Is this actually happening, and if so, has it impacted your life in the days of a British ambassador?
Do you want to pass the mic to Simon and just perhaps ask a question? I'll take 2 together.
Thanks. My question was about it's about relations between Japan, China, and Korea, which are clearly at very low levels right now and very tense. Clearly, the US is trying to do what it can to relieve those tensions. Is the UK, are you and your colleagues in the region trying to do anything to contribute to lowering tensions? And more broadly, do the bad relations complicate the job that you have to do in the region?
I'll answer that carefully. Alan, your question about Commonwealth resources. The British government, the coalition government, is very committed to the Commonwealth, the whole concept of the Commonwealth, and to ensuring that in developing relations with new partners around the globe, we don't neglect traditional partners. We have got examples of sharing of resources in 1 or 2 posts around the world. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but where, for example, you might find that a British embassy is co-located with the Canadians, or we're supporting somebody, one of our other Commonwealth partners somewhere. We don't have anything of that nature here in Seoul, although we work very closely with Canada, Australia and New Zealand, as with the other ascending states within the context of the UN command. The UK has a very good relationship with both Korea and with Japan. It's the objective of the British government to deepen the relationship in the years to come. I think in both cases, our government's view is that both of those countries share our economic values, share our political values, and we are convinced that both of them have the potential to play a very constructive and helpful role internationally in tackling some of the big global challenges that we're facing, whether it's the economic challenges of managing the global economy, advancing the cause of open trade relationships, or tackling climate change, or whether it's the big security issues like proliferation. It's unquestionably the case that for friends of Korea, for friends of Japan, we would like to see better, more constructive relations between the two countries. With others, we will do what we can to try to encourage both governments to re-establish more constructive relationships, while making sure that sensitivities on both sides are taken into account.
Okay, I found the heritage is great. I know British heritage is great because I lived in London a long time ago, but I understand the British Council is now trying to let or make the Korean people understand better about the British heritage in Korea. But I wonder whether British Embassy or British Council try to make British residents in Korea to give access or to be accustomed to or to know better about the Korean heritage. I wonder whether you can have any kind of program or you have any suggestion for the Korean heritage associations or institutions to try to introduce Korean heritage to the British people or British residents in Korea.
British residents in Korea rather than British residents in the UK. It's not our job. That's the job of a variety of different Korean organisations. But I think that it's for any foreign resident, and that includes British residents, it doesn't matter how long or short the period of time you're going to be spending in Korea is, that time will be more rewarding for you if you are able to engage and take an interest in Korean history and Korean culture. And organisations such as the Society here, I think, play a really important role in opening up new areas to foreign residents. I think that both for residents and for foreign tourists as well, there is scope for making the experience of foreigners visiting some of the many beautiful and fascinating historic sites in Korea, to make that experience more rich and rewarding in the way in which it's presented. And I think that is something that the United Kingdom is particularly good at. And there are things that Korean organisations can learn from our experience. And indeed, I know that there's a lot of studying of our experience in the National Trust in the UK. There are people in Korea that are very interested in that and trying to learn from that in the way in which they present some of Korea's most interesting places, not just to foreigners, but also to Koreans as well. So I think there are things that can be done, but it's not the embassy's job, and it's not the British Council's job either.
Your
embassy in Pyongyang, South Korea has no representative, America has no representative. Under the rather critical situation, North Korea and the US, can I expect some kind of on-the-spot report, etc., helping all the matter, North Korean nuclear missile, etc., the problem solving? I hope you are the pioneer of all the diplomacy. Your embassy in North Korea can help. Some kind of contribution to on-the-spot report, with their on-the-spot report to US, South Korea, etc. Can I expect too much, or?
That's a reasonable expectation. We're not the only people that are represented in Pyongyang. There are 7 European Union members that have got embassies
but
there.
You are the good friend of America.
And what we and they do is we do share the experience and the observations that our colleagues in Pyongyang are making with people here, with colleagues in Washington, in Tokyo as well, because obviously it's a vital national interest for the Japanese government as well. It's very difficult for embassies in Pyongyang to access information, but even some of the anecdotal observations that people are able to make, what's available in the markets, what people are wearing, what the rate of exchange is, the black market exchange, the official rate of exchange, all of that sort of information, the quality of the conversations that diplomats are having with officials in North Korea, all of that is of interest. And this is a collective endeavour, and so we don't keep all of that information to ourselves.
You know, you all have lots of official and big questions, but I have a little small personal question. Well, I came here a little late, so I don't know whether you mentioned this or not, but when you get into your embassy, you stay at homestay, right? And when I read that you were planning to stay at homestay for several days before you get to the embassy, I found that was really interesting, and personally I felt really great because you really want to know about Korea. So what did you enjoy the most when you had a homestay in Korea, and why did you decide to do that?
Thank you. It wasn't a long homestay, it was 3 weeks. And if I'd been able to stay longer, the main objective would have been to try and improve my Korean language. 3 weeks is enough to do. I'd been studying Korean before I came out here. 3 weeks of immersion like that isn't nearly long enough. But my objective was just to, I hoped that the experience would give me some insights, some small insights into the way in which ordinary Korean people live their lives. And it was invaluable in that respect. And the couple that took care of me could not have been kinder, could not have been more generous in their time, in sharing their experience and sharing their home, and indeed the rest of their wider family with me. So that was the most valuable thing I got out of it. But I also got 3 weeks of exposure to home Korean cooking, and that was a terrific experience as well, because every breakfast, every dinner, I was having with my hosts, and that was absolutely authentic, and it was terrific.
Yeah, now that the Korea-EU free trade agreement has been underway for a couple of years, that was always in the details of the implementation. So, from your perspective, what has surprised you the most, or if not surprised you, what do you find the most interesting aspect of the implementation, particularly in regards with trade between UK and Korea?
I guess the most interesting thing has just been the speed at which it has an impact on the trade figures, and it's certainly from the UK-Korea perspective, it's a very good example of how both partners in bilateral, by liberalising trade, both partners, both economies benefit. We haven't not yet got the full year figures for 2013 exports, but in 2012, Korean exports, which was the first full year for FTA, in 2012, Korean exports to the UK increased by 24%, and that was during a period in which the UK economy was flat. UK non-oil goods exports to Korea in 2012 increased by 15%, and I think they're going to increase by another 15% last year as well. If you include oil, the increase was even greater. So that's been very impressive, really encouraging, and there are further benefits to be gained. There's been quite a lot of reporting in the Korean press looking at the headline figures of bilateral trade between the European Union and Korea, and it does show that Korea has moved from a trade surplus into a trade deficit since the implementation of the free trade agreement. But that's got nothing to do with the FTA. It's got everything to do with the state of the Eurozone economy and the significant reduction in the imports or orders of Korean ships by Europeans, and then fall off in the purchase of consumer goods, Korean consumer goods by European consumers because they're having a bad time. As the European economy picks up, we're going to see Korean exports picking up. And we can, by analysing the various sectors covered by the free trade agreement, both ways, we can see very clearly that in sectors of the economy covered by the free trade agreement, exports have increased. So the FTA has created jobs and saved jobs in Korea. It's created jobs and saved jobs in the European Union as well.
London Book Fair.
Yes.
Anything you can say about the London Book Fair this year with Korea?
Yeah, no, we're really excited. The London Book Fair will take place in April, and Korea is the guest nation at the London Book Fair, and 10 Korean authors are going to be featured at it. The Korean Minister of Culture will visit London for the official opening. Maria Miller, the British Culture Secretary, will attend the official opening as well. She's very committed to the whole project. And British Council will shortly be bringing 3 British journalists who specialise in book reviewing to Korea in advance so that they can meet some of the showcase authors and make sure that when the book fair takes place, not only the people that are visiting the fair will have the opportunity to engage with Korean literature, but also through the medium of Times Literary Supplement and other publications, they can reach out to a much wider audience. And our hope is that as a consequence of this, we'll find more British publishers wanting to translate some of the really interesting writing that's going on in Korea and introduce a new audience, not just in the UK, but more widely to Korean literature.
Thank you very much. Call it a day.